I hope that these presentations have provided you with some insight about USU research and how it may address the opportunities and challenges in family roles that you may be experiencing. I hope that you've been able to identify some quick tools and resources that you can share or use to improve your family's quality of life. At this point, I invite you to turn your cameras on, and our researchers are here to participate in the Q&A. And at this point then, I will turn it over to Wyatt Trauber, who will moderate.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. And thanks to Beth, Shawn, and Brian. It's always a great opportunity to get to work with you and learn more about your research. While we're getting started, we have a very brief, very anonymous poll, and we'd like you to take the time to answer it. We just want to get a sense of who we have in our audience. So in our RSVP for this event, we asked you to indicate your professional affiliations, which is something we always do, but we didn't ask about your family affiliations. So there's just a few questions so we can understand what type of elder caregiver relationships you may have in your life, what type of sibling relationships you may have in your life, and what type of stepfamily relationships you may have in your life. And we'll share the results from this poll in just a minute. But while we're waiting for those poll answers to come in, Shawn, to start, I'd like to bring up a theme I've noticed when I talked to you in the past, when we shot your video for the research for the 2019 College Researcher of the Year, in that you mentioned how people can be more open to improving their sibling relationships. To that point, it can be a good entry point for more wanting to improve family relationships. So Shawn, I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, and then Brian and Beth, after Shawn expands on that, I'd like to have some of your input as well.
Yeah, thanks, Wyatt. Sibling relationships are really interesting, especially in childhood and adolescence, because they are a relationship unlike any other. They combine aspects of power imbalances, where an older child has more power than a younger child, given their developmental advantages, but also more peer-like than a parent-child or hierarchical relationship. And they're one of the rare relationships where we allow arguments, fights, and physical abuse to occur. I often poll students in my classes about the percentages of sibling relationships that involve an incident that would be considered assault. So it meets the legal definitions for assault. And they are actually fairly accurate in that 60 to 70% of sibling relationships involve an incident that could be considered assault and take you to jail if you performed it in any other setting. And I often juxtapose that against, think about a romantic relationship or during adolescence, and we would say the same thing. What if 60 to 70% of adolescent teen relationships, romantic relationships, involved in assault? What would we say? We would be appalled, and we wouldn't let that occur. And we already have too high of elevated rates of assault and domestic violence, but we allow it in sibling relationships. And so as a society, we have normalized bad behavior in these sibling relationships. And so they're ripe for intervention and ripe for opportunity for us to help shape them towards more healthy relationships. And then we know, and by work that people like Brian do, that if we improve these relationship qualities early in life, it'll have long-lasting benefits for both their health, mental and physical, and relationships moving forward.
And Shawn, what about sibling-based interventions makes it easier or parents more likely to engage with an intervention or education program?
It's also very easy to tell a parent, I want to help make your kids get along better. And it's less judgmental and less confrontational than saying, I want to make you a better parent, because there is judgment in that. And there's an idea that you may not be effective in that role, but because we've normalized and accepted that sibling relationships are these highly conflictual, highly ambivalent relationships that include both high love, but also this high conflict and physical violence in many cases. They offer what we call an entree into the family that is non-judgmental and confrontational to the caregiver. And we hope a way for us to benefit the entire family. One of the things that family interventions and family education, relationship education does, is it's not just a direct benefit for that one relationship. You can improve other relationships by taking those skills that you're learning to be a better sibling into your relationships with your parents and be less confrontational, into your future relationships with a romantic partner and have more harmony and less conflict. Perhaps become a better co-parent, as Brian was alluding to in his presentation. So these are lifelong skills, and if we can find a way into families, and I think sibling relationships, given their ubiquity that almost everyone has them, are a really good way to enter them without confrontation and without judgment.
Yeah. Beth and Brian, can you speak a little bit about the judgment that might keep people from your intervention programs?
I was just going to mention real quickly too, if you think that you have issues with your siblings in adolescence, wait till you have to care for a parent with dementia, and you have to navigate those really tricky questions about paying for care and who's going to be the one to take on the care, and why do you get to go on vacation when I have to be home with mom? I never get to go on vacation. So some of the family-based interventions that I'd mentioned in the presentation, those kinds of issues really come up. And sort of like this really maybe more volatile time in sibling relationships and adolescence kind of calms down and hopefully in early adulthood, but then the stress of having the, mutual concern for a parent and a really tricky and complicated, emotional and physical job to do and financial and things like that. So I'll just mention that, yeah, work on these relationships earlier than later, because it will come back and add to an already difficult situation of trying to care for a parent. So I know Wyatt, you also, Brian, I'll let you answer too, because yours was more specific, I think, to interventions as a whole and not necessarily siblings.
Well, yeah, in terms of barriers to interventions, I mean, time is a huge one for a lot of us. There's certainly some interventions that are more stigmatized than others. For some people, thinking to go to a therapist is, means that there's something wrong with them. And the reality is that probably all of us could benefit from a good therapist, just helping us think through some of the, the challenges and issues we have in our lives. But beyond that, just, we're busy. We have kids to take to dance or sports, and we got partners to take care of, we got jobs to do. And so I think one of the things that USU Extension and USU as a whole is doing just remarkably well to help is in creating more online options, services and interventions, educational programs, degree programs that people can take from the, from their home computer at night when the kids are to bed or on weekends. So there's certainly going to be individuals who just aren't comfortable with those approaches. But I guess the research that I'm doing and seeing says that if you can overcome whatever that barrier may be, whether it's fear or uncertainty or time, you tend to get a lot out of those educational programs.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Beth. So now I'm going to go over some of the results of the poll. It looks like we have 20% of the people participating today are a caregiver for an elderly parent or somebody else. And then 94% of the people in this event have a sibling, and 20% of the people here are a step parent, and 17% of the people who respond to this poll report themselves as being a stepson or stepdaughter. So Beth, we did a quiz before this event, and in our little quiz, people's average guess of the amount of people age 65 and over living in a nursing home was 35%. You mentioned in your presentation, it's just 5%. Does that gap surprise you, or is that kind of like what you normally see?
No, it's exactly what I would see and what I would expect too. And I probably would have felt the same way if I, hadn't studied this area. And I think it's, again, because we just have this common perception that older people are not cared for in America. Like, other countries must be doing this so much better than us. And I just really, the data doesn't support that. We are family caregivers. And the other thing that I think is important to talk about is transitioning somebody to assisted living or a nursing home is not a failure. It's an important step in someone's care and their safety. And it's a really important step for the well-being of the caregivers. And so that should never be viewed as, I just couldn't cut it, and there's something wrong with me, that I couldn't handle the stress, and I couldn't do the lifting, and I don't know how to care for these kind of really complicated behaviors. So I think sometimes getting that message across, and everyone in this audience, if you hear somebody kind of complaining and saying, you know, we just don't do it well in America. We don't take care of our old people. You can say, well, actually, the data supports that we do. We care for our loved ones at home, and we do a really good job. And when that transition to a, you know, assisted living or nursing home happens, it's needed. And most caregivers wait too late in terms of the impact on their own mental and physical health, that we see that, you know, they hang on sort of until there's a real crisis situation and their own health and well-being is compromised before they make that transition. So you guys can help get the word out. We do a really good job with family caregivers. Nursing home and assisted living are there for a reason, really good reason. And, you know, that again, the point I think here would be, let's support the people at home, recognize that there are a lot of people doing a really tough job, and letting them know there's resources out there, and, you know, they're not doing this alone.
Beth, what kind of community resources exist for somebody in a caregiver position, like here in Cache Valley, maybe along the Wasatch Front in rural Utah as well?
Yeah. So in the, you know, I mentioned for people that like online resources, the Alzheimer's Association has really good website, lots of different explanations for different kinds of dementia. There's also for people that are feeling like there's kind of a more complicated cognitive thing going on, you're not quite sure if it's dementia. There's a memory clinic down at University of Utah Medical Center that does a very comprehensive job in kind of diagnosing if there's more complicated things going on. But I think for most people, it's more the, you know, how to care for somebody at home. The Department of Health in Utah sponsors Dementia Dialogues, which is a really high quality program. It's been evaluated empirically to show that it's effective. That's offered here in Cache Valley. And the Area Agency on Aging, so that's a county, Bragg in our area, the Bear River area government, they offer some support groups. And there's also, you know, additional support groups offered by other assisted living facilities and things like that in town. So we actually have quite a bit of resources available here in this area. And so if anybody, you can email me, I can give you those links, or I can put them in the chat or something like that. If anybody wants to kind of reach out to some of those groups, they're good.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. I'll give you a second to catch your breath. Shawn, Patsy Stoddard wants to know, how would you deal with a sibling who bullies the younger sibling?
It's a really excellent question. Before I answer it, I'm going to provide some research basis for it. So sibling bullying is something that contributes negatively and uniquely to children and adolescents' health and well-being, both mental health and physical health. And so I say uniquely is above and beyond whether you're bullied at school. So work by Karina Jenkins Tucker at the University of New Hampshire indicates that sibling bullying is a unique and above and beyond predictor of kids' mental health difficulties. And you can think about it in two ways. One is that kids don't ever get an escape. If you're bullied at school and then you're bullied at home, you actually have no safe place. And it's similar to online bullying is also shown that same pervasiveness, that you can never escape it. And so it really is and does have detrimental effects for kids' well-being. And what I would recommend is that you intervene with both the older sibling, or presumably the sibling who's perpetrating the bullying, and the victim of the bullying, and you clearly lay out that this is unacceptable, and you lay out how, you know, they can manage their relationships better. You can seek therapy and relationship education. We have negative stigmas against therapy sometimes, and family-based therapy to talk about the dynamics that may be in play. But we want to prevent that, and that's one of the anecdotes I talked about assault earlier. It's not trivial, and these, you know, statistically and impactfully they have demonstrated impact on youth well-being and negatively in terms of their mental health, depressive symptoms, anxiety, and school performance. So it is something that you want to try to curtail to the best of the ability. And whether that's directly intervening with the siblings, taking them to therapy, having family systems therapy, visiting with a couple and family therapist, would all be recommended strategies.
Yeah. How much, Jim Swayze wants to know, how much of this is just kind of learning how to figure things out, and like, as we mature from kids to adults, because he says that when he was 5, he was kind of the punching bag in the family, and now he has great relationships with all his siblings.
I mean, across our life course, we have opportunity to renegotiate our relationships and you know, involve in new ways. I would err on the side of caution and say, let's not allow youth to engage in those behaviors as we evolve. We evolve in our thinking in terms of corporal punishment and things like that over time. And I think it would be, and we're talking about averages, and there's certainly youth who are resilient and will come out of difficult situations looking great, and others that won't. And so, there is normative learning, but in terms of bullying and physical, I don't want to keep, physical interactions, not, wrestling and horseplay is expected, but actual physical assault and violence, I don't think we want to have in our relationships. And if we characterized it as domestic violence, which it should be, I think we would have a different feel for it. And so I would urge that, moving forward, we want to try to avoid that in sibling relationships growing up. And it reflects some of the normativeness that we allow it.
Yeah. Brian, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on this, because if there's a blended family, there's additional complexities to violence or assault between siblings and then step siblings.
Yeah, I haven't researched that personally, so I don't know if I can say a whole lot on the abuse or bullying component of it, other than to say, I think the general rule of thumb is not to force love. And sometimes trying to force two individuals who, teenagers or 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and putting them in a room and telling them, hey, you need your brothers now or your sisters now, and we're going to be a big happy family. Don't come out of this room until you can get along with each other. Probably is going to lead to more frustration and more hard feelings between the two than if you give them their space.
Yeah. Brian, Kiara Wilson wants to know, have you done any follow-up studies with the participants of divorce education courses, looking at the effects that these courses have on the children?
So here in Utah, our contract with the courts does not allow us to follow up with individuals long-term, but there is research from other states that indicates that those who do participate in these divorce education programs over time do show improvements in or reductions in the amount of conflict with the ex-partner and enhance parent-child relationships. So while we don't have Utah data to verify that, that is where the field is pointing us.
Yeah. And how do children benefit? So that's the divorce education course. How do children benefit from the step family education courses?
Well, there's a lot of different kinds of step family education programs in Utah. I think we're the only game in town, at least in the systematic way. Our program allows for kids, in a non-COVID environment, to come together as part of this group interaction, this group intervention. And so the adults are in one room and having the opportunity to discuss how to better communicate and deal with the transitions. And then teenagers are in their own room, and kids ages 6 to 11 are in another. And so we've done a couple of studies that show that from the kids' perspective, that one of the coolest thing about these programs is that they feel more normal. A lot of them already are self-conscious because of just, being teenagers. But knowing that there are other kids going through the same situation and hearing from them how they're applying the principles that are being taught about, getting along with somebody, even if you don't, like them, how to empathize with where your parent is and why they might have chosen to marry somebody else, even though you weren't necessarily, ready for your parents to move in with somebody else. And learning from others is just tremendously empowering as they then go back into their own home and say, hey, I can do this.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Beth, I want to know what kind of conflicts exist between siblings when one of them is the primary caregiving role. I mean, they got to figure out how to take care of an elderly parent.
Yeah, so I think, clearly the primary caregiver tends to feel that they've got more burden. And I say that word burden, and it really sounds negative. They usually want the role. They're usually the one, again, who's geographically closest. They have the most free time. They've sort of stepped into that role quite willingly. But then as things evolve and the care gets more just difficult in terms of the complexity and the physical, managing physical and cognitive issues just becomes difficult, that person does tend to feel locked in. They call it role captivity, this idea that they can't get out of this role. And if you understand dementia, it can last for years, up to, 5 years, some 15 years. I mean, depending on when the person was diagnosed. So this could be a really long-term, chronically stressful situation. So that person tends to feel that they, at least at some point, they got the short end of the stick. However, the siblings that are not as involved in the care, probably for very practical reasons, often feel lots of guilt and want to help, but don't really know how to help. And so they don't really ask the questions I think that they could to try to facilitate ways to help, let's say remotely. They often also feel excluded. And so there's a little bit of resentment that you get to spend all this time, let's say with dad, and you get to have all these moments with him, and I don't get to have any moments with him because I don't live close by, or I don't get to be as involved. And so or things like, difficult decisions, like the transition to put somebody in assisted living. The siblings may say, he's not ready for that. It's like, well, he may be ready for that. And I'm the one doing the care. And so I get to make the decisions. And so again, it's this sort of dynamic of going back to, and maybe in a way, this is related to what Shawn was saying too, the ability to have conflict with siblings is just a little different. I mean, we wouldn't do this with our coworkers, even if we have a really difficult decision to make it work. But we would do it with our siblings, right? We might call them names or tell them, you're always this way. You've been this way since, you were a teen. Mom always loved you better, whatever that is. So yeah, I think it absolutely is a complicated part of providing care. But as Shawn and Brian both mentioned too, that families have an opportunity here to say, this is a challenge, this is a crisis, or this is an opportunity for us to work together and try to figure things out. And I think that giving people permission to say, let's sit down in a room, with a counselor, or maybe even trying it without, and saying, okay, what does the primary caregiver need? What is the sibling that's doing a lot of the physical care? What do they need? Do they need a break? Do they want to go on a vacation? Okay, let's figure out a week that so-and-so can come and stay with mom so this person gets a break. Or do they need housekeeping? Would that help? Can I pay for, DoorDash or one of these food delivery companies to come one day a week to, help with food or whatever that is. So having those conversations that where you recognize the work that the person's doing, and I think also talking about how appreciative you are of the person that's providing care. I mean, people are really willing to do extremely difficult and challenging things if they feel like it's getting recognized and appreciated. The hardest thing is to be doing all this work and nobody notices and nobody gives you any kind of feedback that what you're doing is valuable. So that's something I think siblings or even friends and neighbors, if you know somebody that's a caregiver, tell them what they're doing is really important, and then it's difficult and you appreciate what they're doing. I think that's really valuable for somebody going through something difficult. So you sometimes see them tear up. I mean, if somebody says, thank you for what you're doing for your mom, and it can be very emotional in a positive way. Somebody's finally kind of saying thank you, because with dementia, the care receiver can't always say thank you. They can't always reciprocate, that kind of feedback.
Yeah. Beth, Amy Kahn wants to know, what is the economic impact on families in which there is a member that needs a caregiver?
Well, it can go in either direction. I would say there's a statistic that just popped into my head, and it's not exactly the answer. I will get to the answer. Family caregivers are providing $450 billion in care a year. So basically, if family caregivers weren't doing care, that's what we would be paying for that kind of level of care. So that's a big kind of macro level economic thing. But I think the question was about the kind of the more family dynamic, and you can see a financial shift in a caregiving situation. It can be that a caregiver has to quit their job or change their hours at work to care for a parent, and that can kind of add some additional financial instability in the family. It can be that you have to kind of negotiate who is going to pay for the care for the loved one. If they have savings for themselves, maybe that's how it's used or not. So yeah, it has. I mean, it definitely, again, not my research per se, but research in general has shown that there is a large financial impact on both kind of the national level, but also at the family level for dementia care. However, family care and care at home is significantly less expensive than care at an assisted living or nursing home, even if you're bringing in paid help. So, for where it's possible to have, paid helper come to the house for a little while, that will actually be less expensive than assisted living.
Okay, Beth, I have one more question for you at this moment, at least. Valerie Donahoe wants to know, how do you deal with a parent with dementia who wants to blame you for everything that they aren't happy about?
You say, I recognize what you're doing is difficult and thank you for caring for this person, right? I think that this is it's a natural part of dementia and Alzheimer's, and it can be really, really tough. There is somebody who has, let's say, it depends a little bit on their level of impairment, but somebody with some kind of milder impairment, they don't have a lot of control in their life, right? They don't have control over what they're eating or maybe even where they're staying or what they're doing for the day. And so sometimes some of the interpersonal dynamics are tough because the person's kind of trying to exert control over the things they can, which is like food or what TV show is on or something like that. So that kind of criticism can really be difficult to live with because it feels kind of constant and of course, again, not recognizing the value that the caregiver is providing. So I think later on in the disease, you have to start to understand that things like, some of the interpersonal exchanges are actually more of a result of the dementia itself doing brain damage, where a person may be paranoid. They may have changes to their inhibitions area of their brain, so they'll be willing to say stuff they wouldn't normally have ever been willing to say. And they may have agitation and confusion, and some of these, they just may not be feeling that great, basically because of some of the changes happening in their brain. So there's some ability to try to get the person, again, in that stage to feel comfortable and to try to reduce their agitation. But there is also a lot of where the caregiver has to do a lot of self-training in deep breathing exercises and things like that, where you have to recognize somebody with brain damage who cannot control their behavior might keep replicating some of these same behaviors. And a caregiver has to sort of learn some skills to just live with that instead of trying to change that, which of course is really difficult, but where things like respite and stress management, coping interventions, social support groups, those kinds of things can really be helpful.
Yeah, so that's how some of the stuff that a caregiver could do if they're feeling some blame from the person they're taking care of. Brian, I'm curious what things that a step parent could do, what kind of skills they could have if they feel like that their stepchildren are blaming them for the changes to the family.
Well, they're in good company. I mean, that's becomes par for the course. So you kind of have to get into these relationships knowing that not everyone's going to be thrilled that you're there. And, you got to play the long game. And one of the things that we, teach, and I already talked about in video, was just having realistic expectations of the development of the relationships, and realize that relationships take time, and have thick skin, and don't stoop to the level of the criticisms and the backbiting and whatever else is going on, but try to be a positive example, exude positivity, try to facilitate positive interactions, and where possible, appropriately, invite your partner to have the conversations with those children, rather than trying to take over and step in and say, hey, not in my house, you can't talk to me like that. It's usually best to have those hard conversations come from the biological parent.
Yeah. Brian, how does this do? Oh, sorry. This is a question from Bruce Bullingbroke. He wants to know, how do step family and divorce programs compare to emotionally focused couples therapy? So, like, what kind of is the role of these education courses versus couples therapy?
Yeah, good question. When we develop educational programs, extension programs, relationship education programs, we really design them for the masses. Programs that people can take in groups or people can take online, that are dealing with general issues, kind of common principles, best practices for family life development or relationship development. Therapies like emotionally focused therapies tend to be more focused on individuals, in some cases couples or families, but they're designed to help individuals work through specific issues. And so the focus more on family life education is, group learning, individual, personal application of principles, not kind of hands-on in your life, in your mind, delving into your past or into your heart, with a trained therapist who can help you work through, a particular issue.
And what kind of responses have you seen as you've watched people in these courses? How do they interact with other people in step family courses?
There's a lot of this in normalizing, again, a relief that other people are going through the same situation. And we've done studies with to test this and to observe this with ethnically diverse step families, with sexually diverse step families. It's kind of a common phenomenon that when you participate in these family life education programs, you realize that you are normal, that other people are going through comparable circumstances, and that is empowering, as I've said previously. And so they then go back into their home saying, hey, we can do this. And this is a principle that we learned that maybe we need to do a little bit more of. Maybe we need to communicate more or have some family councils, and we need to have some more fun rather than only have our interactions be about when there are negative things going on. So generally, I would say, I don't go into everybody's home after the courses, so I can't tell you exactly what's happening. But by and large, the reports that we hear back from our studies are that the principles are transferred into the home and do help enhance the relationships.
Yeah. Shawn, do you have any, Brian talked a little bit about therapy with couples and families. Do you have any information on how therapy can help sibling relationships and what that approach might look like?
There isn't a lot of research on sibling therapy that I know of, but I'm also not a therapist or clinically trained, so I may not know that literature as well. What I will say is there's a big focus that parents and siblings in later life, as Beth alluded to, should have on equity. Siblings are very sensitive to differences in treatment, perceived or real, and throughout the life course. And so research shows that youth and adults who perceive themselves being treated differently than their siblings by a parent, and perceived differently generally means less favored, but sometimes more favored, is related to all sorts of bad things relationship-wise and for that individual's well-being. And so one of the things that research suggests is that when youth, especially, and adults though, understand the reasons for treatment. So why am I treating you differently? Why am I giving you this privilege? Why am I making you the executor of the will instead of your sibling? That goes a long way to mitigating the problems associated with the differential treatment. I think we see some of that in what Beth was discussing earlier, that in fact, in older adulthood, the number one topic of fighting between siblings is about taking care of mom and dad, or mom or dad. And it disproportionately generally falls on one person. Parents have a say in this. If there's residential proximity to multiple siblings, there's research by Jill Suter and Carl Pillemer that parents tend to focus on somebody who's more similar to them and holds similar values. Unfortunately, there's disproportionate allocation across genders. Women are more likely to be pulled into the caregiving role than our daughters are more likely to be pulled into the caregiving role than sons. But having explanation for that perhaps will help mitigate some of the issues in the perceived or real inequity. And so explaining kind of some of the things that Brian was talking about, having conversations, explaining why we're doing this, and what my expectations are, and how this, how I view this as equitable, even if it's you don't. This is why I'm treating you in this way, is important and will help. What research suggests would help mitigate long-term problems.
Yeah. So Shawn, 97% of the people who responded to the poll in this meeting said that they had siblings. What does that indicate about the need for this research?
I mean, I'm so biased because I'm in the field, and it was one of my studies that pointed out that only 3% of the literature is focused on, of close relationships is focused on siblings. I don't know why we overlook them as a society, as a science. Brian, with complex and step families, the literature on step families and step siblings is scant, and it doesn't make sense. There's so many people that are impacted by it, and it happens at all sorts of different phases of your life. When I got married 12 years ago, I also was introduced to my step parents. Both my parents remarried after 25 years of divorce, at least, if not more, the same year I was married. And so I was introduced to stepfamily in adulthood, and all of a sudden I had step siblings that I never had. So these are complex relationships that occur for a lot of people. You know, I get excited about it. I don't know why other people don't, but everybody does. I mean, almost everybody has a sibling, even with declining fertility rates across the country. Still, the large majority of folks grow up with siblings. And so they're influential. They're the longest lasting relationship experience most people will ever have. And I always like to say for twins, they are literally womb to tomb.
Yeah. So there's not very much research, but in your talk there, like you showed a slide of a whole bunch of like materials about birth order and stuff. What's the difference between the popular media stuff and like the actual research?
The popular conceptions about birth order and birth order determined my life and my personality is not well backed by science. At least the science that is very, you know, what's the right word? Rigorous. And so I have a lot of skepticism about birth order as determining factors of life. I look at sibling relationships, however, the experiences you had in that family as very influential on your life. And so it's not deterministic because you're a middle child that you're going to have a more passive personality. In fact, there's even a book called Born to Rebel that suggests that later borns are more likely to be rebellious. You know, again, I think the research that supports that is anecdotal and not as rigorous as other designs that suggest that birth order is not deterministic of personality type, of how you'll get along with folks. But your experiences in that family are very influential. And so if we take the focus off of, you know, kind of where you were and in order and focus on what your experiences were, I think we'll see much stronger relationships to the outcomes that people typically associate with birth order.
Yeah, Shawn, this question isn't exactly in your field, so maybe Beth and Brian might have some comments on that as well. But has there been any research done on family gossip for either positive or negative effects on the family? Like some stories circulate for decades, both good and bad. And I've seen if one person is told news, it's best to assume that the entire extended family knows that news within a week. And this question is from Robert Gates. So I guess just kind of like, what role does gossip play in families in these relationships? And Beth and Brian, we can come to you after Shawn answers.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to some work by some family communication scholars that suggests, well, one thing, general systems theory and family systems theory, families are systems and they're networks. And just like any other network, you can assume that there's connections between them and that something that you say to one person is going to move. That's not unlike any other network, it will move throughout. I'm thinking of some research by a faculty member who was at USU, she's now at Michigan State University, that focused on black sheep in the family and how some of these stories lead to ostracism, both you know, by the person's choice or by the family's behavior. And you know, communication is really important and key, and family communication scholars would probably have a better perspective on this than us, but these stories can lead to negative outcomes for individuals in terms of ostracism, in terms of their thoughts about the family. And so, you know, it's not real eloquent, but it is important to try to mitigate or correct at some point. And maybe Beth or Brian will have some insight as well.
Yeah, Beth, Brian.
You know, I haven't seen any specific research on gossiping the way that Robert's talked about it here, but I will say that, you know, gossip often is a symptom of underlying, you know, communication challenges or lack of skills in a family system. And so, you know, often you're gossiping about somebody because you don't want to confront them themselves yourself, or you don't know how to, or bring up and you have those crucial conversations, or every time you've had a conversation with that particular family member, it's turned into a fight. And so if there is a concern in your family or a family that you love, that gossip is, you know, kind of spreading like wildfire, you know, I would say, you know, take a course on communication or visit with a therapist, or, you know, read some of the, you know, these best practices that, you know, have been recommended in you know, the packet that was sent out. There's some ways to approach these difficult family topics in safe ways that can be constructive rather than destructive, but gossip certainly doesn't help.
Yeah. Beth?
Yeah, I think Brian and Shawn's areas are a little closer to this in terms of research. Mine isn't, but I will say that just in terms of just general things about adult development, we have identities that we create and about ourselves and about others. And sometimes there's some narratives that go along with that, right? That again, if you think about siblings, there's, the responsible one or the artistic one or whatever that may be, that we do that outside of sibling relationships. We do that across lots of relationships. And in general, I think, again, I'm not a therapist and I don't study this to the same degree that this is probably presented, but I can say just, anecdotally, whenever somebody tends to use a statement like, you always do this, or you're this, right? That this sort of all-encompassing thing, there's usually a lot of resistance to that. I mean, people are complicated and we're fluid and we may do something a lot, but we don't always do that. And if we get told, or if we hear, let's say that, we hear that somebody in the family thinks we always do this, we always, stay out too late, and we always have risky behaviors or whatever that is, we tend to get really upset by that because, again, we're being labeled with this, sort of big statement, not recognizing all the times we haven't done that. And so I think just in terms of general communication within a family, good practice would be to try to avoid the big statements about who somebody is all the time. And, you always do this or you never do this. It just tends to result in a lot of argument about that statement. I do that sometimes, or, not all the time. And just doesn't seem like a really helpful way to talk about somebody. Maybe again, just recognizing that there may be patterns in someone's behavior, but they're not just one thing. They're not one aspect of their own behavior. So I'm outside of my wheelhouse a little bit here because
No, you're good. You're good. Well, we can put you back in your wheelhouse because Amanda Crosby wants to know, how do you think COVID-19 will impact the rates of people put into elder care? It seems like it might cause some reluctance. And this is going to be our last question. Shawn and Brian, after Beth answers, I'm curious what things you've seen change because of COVID-19, if you want to end with that comment, but we'll start with Beth.
It's such a good question. I think that our older adults were impacted so much by COVID. Everybody was impacted by COVID, but they are such a vulnerable group, and so the need to keep people safe and not have people going into assisted living and nursing homes was real, and we had to do it. I would say I would be certain that there would be reluctance for people to place somebody in a facility because they might feel that, what if this happens again? I have to say, I've only had one pandemic my whole life, so hopefully we're one and done, and go ahead and do what needs to be done. And if something else like that comes up where we're prevented from visiting our loved ones regularly, we'll deal with that when we get there. I hope that it doesn't cause people to say, well, this is the new reality, and we shouldn't be putting people in assisted living if it's appropriate care for them. So again, it's a great question, because I imagine there is going to be some kind of impact, and it's going to happen in these discussions of like, well, what happens if they go in and then we can't see them regularly? I will say that I work with the state, and I work with local care facilities, and the work that was being done in these facilities during COVID was outstanding. I mean, the care, families were so frustrated, and rightfully so, they missed their loved ones, but the nursing care that was going on in there, the activities that were happening were really high quality. So I hope it's not a barrier, although I imagine it probably will. We're going to see the long-term implications of COVID, I think, in a lot of ways across a lot of different populations.
Yeah. Brian, how has COVID stressed step families, or what have you seen change because of it in your work?
Well, let me respond maybe this way. There's a saying that, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And in family life, we often compare ourselves to our neighbors and to those that we, the stories that we see on, Instagram or Facebook. I think what COVID has done is helped us focus on, our own yard. I often say, the grass is greener wherever it gets the most water. And the yards that get the most nourishment and the most care tend to look the nicest. And if that's your neighbors, well, then do something about it with your own yard, right? And I think during COVID, that's what I've seen. I've only talked about 2 programs today, but the extension system has a whole host of different research and programs. And by going to extension.usu.edu, you can find those. But we saw a huge uptick in the number of people who were accessing our programs on couple relationships and parenting programs, as well as our step-family programs. And so I think in some ways, COVID has been good in that it has helped us be more intentional in our relationships and more attentive to those relationships. Relationships are like muscles and they atrophy, but they can also become stronger when you put in the work. And I think COVID has done that for a lot of families.
Yeah, Shawn?
I think to piggyback on what Brian was saying is that families are the primary setting in which COVID played its role. Is we were all forced from other institutions, societal, and forced to be with our families, and there's strengths and weaknesses with that, and struggles and triumphs. And one of the things we're doing in our research now is trying to disentangle and predict for who did things get better and for who did things get worse. And many of the things that you may expect is stress, role overload, things of that nature that increased during COVID is related to poor outcomes in our study of both parent-child relationships, sibling relationships. And so in those families in which parents were overburdened, kids were stressed, they were struggling, and they still may be struggling. COVID's impact was not equal across all settings and strata. And so we see some difficulty, but at the same point, there's opportunity. And parents got to spend more time with their children. They weren't at work, they were at home. And although there was homeschooling or remote schooling, online schooling, there was opportunity to engage in new ways. And so there's all these benefits that also came. And so I think we'll see a lot of ambivalence in which there was both high positivity and high negativity, and trying to understand for who and under which circumstances those outcomes occurred will be really important for us to prepare for future, maybe not pandemics, but things that could have similar impacts, recessions, natural disasters. These could have similar tentacles as a pandemic.
Awesome. Thanks, Shawn, and thanks, Elizabeth and Brian. And that's the end of this Q&A portion. I'm going to turn it back to Vice President for Research, Lisa Burrow.
Well, thank you, Wyatt, and thank you to our researchers for sharing your insights today. Really, really good Q&A session. I also want to thank everyone who came to today's presentation. Thank you for your continued support of USU Research. And of course, thank you to Regents for the partnership that enables us to bring you Blue Plate Research. Before you leave, if you have a chance, we'd appreciate you sharing feedback with us on the event. We have a quick poll question that just came up, plus a slightly longer survey that just appeared in the chat window. We're working on developing our list of speakers and events for the next year, which we'll be announcing in the near future. We're hopeful, keeping our fingers crossed, that those events can move to in-person very soon. If you want to hear more from our researchers, I suggest that you reach out to our website, where you can find instead podcast episodes with these researchers discussing in more detail their research investigations. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and have a good week.
My actual initial forays into research were about siblings being different. And we have just as many reasons to be different as we do to be similar. We have motivations to want to be uniquely identified by our environment, that I'm not my brother or sister and I'm different. And there's both psychological processes that should want to promote that, as well as behavioral.
And you can't have too many caring adults in your life as you're growing up. Having step parents who love you and care about you and are concerned about you can be actually a very positive thing for child development. And so
there's no reason to do this alone. And we know you can do it because you are doing it and you're doing a really good job. But why not give yourself a little help and give yourself a little bit of connection to other people going through this?